Third year wide receivers that are ready to break out, and maybe they are not very obvious at this moment in time. That is what we're going to talk about today on RotoViz Overtime. We have a number of other topics we're going to sprinkle in from some listeners' suggested questions. So we're going to dive straight into it. Shawn, the first thing we're going to do is try and do a bit of manifestation. We had a suggestion to come in from Eric Berg. He's hoping that we can try and will Breece Hall's trade to the Chicago Bears into existence. He thinks it'll be a better spot for him to be sitting than he is at this particular moment in time. I had talked about around the time of the NFL draft, potential rumors around the Seahawks and one of their running backs potentially landing with the Bears. That obviously has not happened. He said either way, he really enjoys the pods, but he's wondering, can we try and put this out there that maybe somebody will hear it and want to be able to suggest that the Bears make the move? What are your thoughts on getting Breece Hall to Chicago here?
Yeah, I actually had that in one of the earlier versions of the Big Gorilla piece, where it was just an open cry to the Jets management to trade him anywhere, right? It would be a bummer for the Brashard Smith enthusiasm. You could trade him to the Chiefs. You could trade him to the Dallas Cowboys. The most obvious one, as you mentioned, is the Chicago Bears, where they're going to add pieces. Colm, it sounds like they're probably discussing either Nick Chubb or J.K. Dobbins. Yeah, maybe they could do both. I mean, it's still obviously very possible that they would do neither. It would be a lot of fun if they would trade for Kenneth Walker. It would similarly be fun if they would trade for Zach Charbonnet to get him out of there. As I was diving into it a little bit more this weekend, thinking about these guys who could benefit from the combination of trends and the combination of profiles, it really jumped back out to me that if you just weren't worried about like a series of bad plays in a game, say Kenneth Walker gets a little bit of a ding and then he's stuffed 3 or 4 times and then he runs sideline to sideline once and the team is just like, we've got to get a north-south runner in there. That's the concern that you have with Kenneth Walker, because otherwise you're talking about someone who, I mean, basically has a first-round profile. You're talking about a guy with size and 4.3 speed, the top evasion rate in the NFL, and a lot of receiving expected points per game. Like, how is that guy not going earlier? Well, the Seahawks have been very disconcerting in terms of what they've done this offseason, and he didn't finish fast. And when you don't finish strong, you leave a very bad taste in everybody's mouth, but including the people who really liked you and wanted you to do well. One of the problems the players have who finish poorly is that they burned their biggest fans, their stalwart drafters. And when you do that, then you've got to find somebody else to pick you. You're going to fall a little bit, maybe beyond where you should. We mentioned there are a lot of running backs who seem pretty favorably priced. So he's not the only person in that bucket. But Colm, I do like the way you kind of set that up, that people like the show, but they would like it a lot better if we could somehow use our magical powers to get Breece Hall on a different roster. That's what we're doing today. As it's not going to be the main focus of the content, but it's the main thing we're doing in the world, is we are manifesting a Breece Hall trade, hopefully to the Chicago Bears.
Yeah, and we can't promise any of these will happen, but if people have other things they want us to try and put out there into ether, feel free to send them in. Probably will have no effect on the outcome of these things, but we can always try our best, Shawn. Moving into the main topic of today's show comes in from TKel, a comment over on YouTube, asking about which non-obvious third-year wide receivers might break out. And he said, not talking about JSN, Addison, Puka, Rice, etc., but guys like Mims, Downs, Reed, Quinten Johnson, etc. And I do think, like, when we look at this, obviously, when you're looking through the names, like, I feel like there's quite a gap in terms of the expectations of some of these. So, like, Addison is mentioned in that first group, but in terms of like where he's going in ADP, obviously there's some fears around a potential suspension to start the season, but he's going as wide receiver 36. I guess the kind of tempering of expectations on him being a real breakout is maybe people would think that he can't be the wide receiver 1 on that team because of Justin Jefferson. But I think that when we pair him with, like, he's probably closer in terms of ADP to the Mims, Downs, Reed kind of category there overall in terms of the ADP. Jayden Reed, for example, going in the 9th round, which is 2 rounds below, but going as wide receiver 44 versus Jordan Addison's wide receiver 36. I think that we can skip over, since that's what the question requests, Shawn, but I think that Addison still has more room to shatter that ADP that he has. For example, if we look at grouped ADPs of Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy, now they might not both return above their ADPs, but it's wide receiver 22, wide receiver 18. We see the likes of T. Higgins, wide receiver 12, Jamar Chase, wide receiver 1. So Justin Jefferson is wide receiver 2, but I do think that Jordan Addison can definitely push himself well up into those top 24 wide receivers. So I think there's enough of a breakout from his ADP to include him in the conversation, really. Then when we look at Mims, Downs, Reed, and Quinten Johnson, they're the specific guys that are mentioned. Maybe we should hit on those first of all. And it's interesting on the Reed one because I feel like he had kind of a true rookie breakout, but then the second season was so disappointing. It feels like he broke rather than broke out. So he's at wide receiver 44, which is only 2 spots ahead of his new running mate and Matthew Golden, who was drafted by the Packers, and both of those guys going in round 9. We'll start off with those names, Shawn. Is there any of those that are projecting as breakouts for 2025 for you? And then maybe we'll go into some names that aren't mentioned.
Yeah, so this was a question that I dove into in some detail in the Big Gorilla piece. And we've talked about a lot. Some people we understand that article is out. But it
Shawn
also
has
included
a 12,000 word piece up on rotoviz.com for people who aren't aware, and you can go over there and you can check it out. And if you aren't a member over at rotoviz.com, you can subscribe with the code RVRadio2025 to get yourself a 10% discount off a 1-year pass.
There you go. There are a handful of sort of mini articles within the larger piece, and one of them looks at this question of the 3rd-year breakout and or this idea of a secondary breakout that takes players to more or less the elite level. On the previous show, we discussed this idea of how do we draft players, or what would our goal be in terms of thinking of upside. We want guys who are going to move multiple rounds. Some of these guys, I think, are most likely to break out in a way that they're not picked in the top 18 picks next year. But once you get beyond that, they have the ability to rise to that next edge, right? You think about where these players are relative to JSN, and in many cases, they're basically the same type of play. And yet JSN is at that 2-3 turn, and the rest of these guys are so much less expensive. And Colm, I mean, we've been all in on Jackson Smith and Jigba, and yet when you look at 2025,
the difference weird. It feels weird this year.
Well, the difference in price is somewhat hard to justify, right? You look at what Jayden Reed has done in his NFL career so far, contrasted with Jackson Smith and Jigba, and you're like, mostly what we have is just a little bit difference in when those points were scored. And if anything, Reed's profile is better. And he's incredibly cheap. So I referenced a variety of articles that Blair wrote on this topic a year ago. Certainly, I think if you want to dramatically up your game of selecting receivers kind of in this breakout-ish range, and you want to be thinking about how secondary breakouts work, make sure you jump over there and get that. They're linked in the piece. But one of the things that we're looking for here are essentially guys who are good, right? And when you look at a Jordan Addison, a Jameson Williams, a Jayden Reed, and you're thinking about how these players have scored, you throw in a Zay Flowers. The other one that's interesting to me is Flowers, because he's also a guy where what he has done to this point is almost the exact same thing that Jordan Addison and Jayden Reed have done. Yeah. And there are probably structural reasons within that Baltimore offense that he is under more threat than the other guys are. Now, he has the ability to be the clear-cut wide receiver 1 in Baltimore in a way that Jordan Addison will just never really have with the Vikings. But even within that,
is smaller.
Yeah, you're looking at structural problems for Flowers that still swamp this objective or this objection that people have to Addison. So one of the things that I wanted to do was look at these guys who sort of break out as rookies, get to the edge of breakout, if not breaking out completely, and then sort of stall in year 2. What does this cohort tend to do in year 3? Colm, when we bring up players who are similar to Addison, Flowers, and Reed, you're talking about guys like Keenan Allen, Calvin Ridley, Sammy Watkins, Garrett Wilson, T. Higgins, Percy Harvin, Chris Olave, T.Y. Hilton, Torrey Smith. When you hear those names, and these, again, are guys who scored between 175 and 225 points in each of their first 2 seasons. Year 3, we get a breakout from Keenan Allen that is a massive breakout in terms of points per game, but is limited a little bit by only playing 8 games. You get a 280-point season from Calvin Ridley. You get a 265-point season from Percy Harvin. You get a 261-point season from T.Y. Hilton. You get a still disappointing for where he was drafted. But again, you think about what these guys have done and then where they were being picked. Garrett Wilson actually scoring in a similar range with these other players was the guy that we liked at the end of round 1. Now, I think that maybe the concern there would be that we liked him at the end of round 1. But even in a disappointing season, goes for 245 points. Now, one of the things I did here, and there might be some minor differences with the week 18 being factored in order just to keep this apples and apples and also focus a little bit more, certainly for the recent guys, on games that were fantasy relevant. I've looked at this through week 17, right? So that's 175 to 225. For that, it allows us to kind of compare back to players who are before the 18 week 17 game season. The shocking thing here, or maybe not shocking, the stunning thing here, I just used 2 words that were the same and said they. The thing that jumps out to you is there just aren't a lot of busts. The guys who fail from this point forward are basically guys who have injuries, right? You're talking about Sammy Watkins, and then the situation with Chris Olave is still up in the air. You think about even someone like Torrey Smith, who's probably the most disappointing player of this entire group. He scores 204 points the following season, but the reason he doesn't score more is because of touchdowns. And then the year after that, he scores 11 touchdowns, right? So if you would have had melded those 2 seasons, he would have also been a big breakout. My point here would be that you have a lot of upside. The potential for a secondary breakout is extreme. And at the same time, your downside is probably minimal. And if you can draft in any type of environment where you get young players and you get a lot of ceiling without risking a very low floor, without risking putting a hole in your lineup, then, that's an absolute fantasy miracle, right? So we think through it. And again, you have the injury-based hole that could always come up. You can make the claim, I think, that as things continue to evolve, maybe these guys do have a little bit more of a downside that maybe historical players had. You have to continue to think through some of those types of things. But I think that when we're talking about JSN, Zay Flowers, and then contrasting that with guys like Jordan Addison and Jayden Reed, the thing that is sort of fun about it is that we at least have several targets who are priced in a way that doesn't make a ton of sense. Something else I would throw in that Blair focuses on a lot, Matt has written about on the site, certainly we talk about from time to time, but one of the things that is just so fascinating about Jayden Reed is that he comes out and still has a ton of receiving FPOE last year, despite all the drops. So one of the things that I would kind of point out is that probably some people are avoiding Jayden Reed because he did have this huge number of drops, or a very high drop percentage last year. The thing that's fascinating when you go back through and look at this is that his on-target catch percentage was actually not that bad for all of the drops. But you can look at guys with very high drop rates. As long as they were high target players in that high drop rate season, going back the last 6-7 years, it doesn't stall them out at all in terms of what their trajectory is. You've got guys like the Bengals receivers. Think about the sort of breakout season last year for Joe Burrow. One of the things that he's always dealt with is that Jamar Chase and T. Higgins drop passes like crazy. So it's not necessarily a huge problem for the Packers. I mean, you'd always prefer the guys just catch the passes, but the big problem that they had last year was just not having that additional viable elite guy to be out there with Reed. Reed himself was probably not anywhere close to 100%, and then they just stopped throwing the ball. You go back in 2025 and you're throwing the ball again, and you have Matthew Golden out there. Absolutely no reason to believe that the drops are going to suddenly get him uninvolved in this offense. And Reed's outlook is for a big bump in opportunity in year 3, in part because Matthew Golden just isn't a problem for him. Probably, right? There's always a risk of overstating that. There's always the possibility that Golden will go out there and take just so many targets that the wide receiver too, especially if they don't go that pass heavy overall, doesn't have as much left for him. But certainly Golden is a much bigger threat to guys like Dobbs and Wicks and to Josh Jacobs than he is to Jayden Reed, because this should return to the 2023 style offense that was so dynamic, that was so dominant. And again, some of these players that I've said Golden is a threat to, not only does he have stylistic differences with as a receiver, but some of them are not even receivers, right? That goes back to this idea that the offense is going to be built around the dynamic pieces, not necessarily saying that you have to do exactly this role or exactly this role, and these roles are going to overlap. When we think about it from that perspective, like how are the Packers going to move the ball and score points? I'm actually pretty enthusiastic about both Golden and Reed at price. I mean, Golden is a reach as a first-round receiver. The Packers are already saying good things about him. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're accurate because they drafted him in the first place despite all these problems. So if you were blind to those things originally, like having a few practices where the guy looks fast is maybe not going to be like, oh, we made a huge mistake right off the bat. But again, at the prices that you're being charged from Matthew Golden, he even is a pretty interesting choice. Colm, the other thing here that I think that we have to look at is that even at a much cheaper price, we can argue that you have a similar thesis for someone like Josh Downs.
Yeah, so I was going to move into the Josh Downs, Marvin Mims, Quinten Johnson part of it. So Josh Downs is going wide receiver 48 over at the FFPC in the Best Ball Tournament, ADP at the moment in round 11. Then you move 2 rounds down. They're all separated by 2 rounds here. Wide receiver 57 in round 13 is Marvin Mims. Then we get into round 15, we get Quinten Johnson at wide receiver 66. So all around 10 wide receiver slots apart. Marvin Mims was somebody we talked about a lot last season, and when he came in as a rookie, had some huge games down the stretch last year, particularly in the playoffs, as him and Bo Nix linked up. And then you get Josh Downs. It feels like there was so much more left on the bone last year due to the quarterback play and the lack of accuracy that was there for him. And then Quinten Johnson, somebody who really struggled very early on, still has his struggles as he continues to this point of his career, but maybe entering year 3 in a Chargers uniform, maybe he could follow that Keenan Allen profile that Shawn talked about earlier. But what's your overall feeling here on these 3? I know that you're probably pretty strong on Josh Downs, but do you think the ADPs in terms of the order of those 3 guys is right? And then dive into some of your thoughts overall on them.
Yeah, so another piece that I did within this massive article looked at guys who were drafted sort of in the range that Quinten Johnson was drafted into, in part because as second-year players, we have Ricky Pearsall and Keon Coleman, who are intriguing picks for a year 2 eruption. And one of the things that I talked about a bit there is that if you go back and you look at receivers drafted in this range and you actually break down their collegiate profile, it's only the guys with elite collegiate profiles who probably should have been drafted in that range, if not a little bit higher, who have historically gone on to break out in a meaningful way in year 2. And so that would raise some questions for Pearsall and Coleman, who really don't have those profiles. Now, QJ is a little bit different in that he gets a lot of criticism for the drops issues, and yet his overall profile is actually much more solid than a lot of these guys who end up being trendier than him through time. And so if he were in a different situation where the team hadn't basically come out and said, we don't really want you, right? By drafting a variety of interesting guys. You get the Trey Harris pick. You get you and I are very high on Keandre Lambert-Smith. We think Aronde Gadsden is a very interesting deep tight end selection. He is someone who probably is now in a very bad situation from a volume perspective. Wouldn't really expect a breakout there, even though you have the massive target game last year at the end of the season. You have him showing up with one of, if not the top evasion rate in the entire NFL last year for receivers. You do need to know how players work and where they win. And if a guy like QJ dominates with the ball in his hands, make sure you figure out how to do that. Right. Yeah. And the Chargers, I think, in fairness, did some of that last season, certainly as much as they could. Again, he has a massive target game that very few other receivers at any point in the year are able to match.
The thing, Shawn, too, with it, you mentioned we like Lambert-Smith, but, Quinten Johnson is in the league for 2 years, but he's 23, well turned 24 just the week of week 1. But, Lambert-Smith turns 24 4 weeks later. So, you're looking at somebody who's come into the league younger, and sometimes I think people are quick to punish that, but he is somebody like last year had 55 receptions, 711 yards, 8 touchdowns. There's still sizable numbers as he moves forward here, but sometimes we can be very excited about the rookies when there's somebody in front of our eyes. Maybe the team's telling us not to be as excited, but I still think there is a path where Quinten Johnson takes that next step forward. There was a big step from year 1 to year 2. Maybe we'll see that to year 3. But the other problem is the team's ethos seems to be that they want to run the ball as much as possible.
Colm, can you hold it against them that the Chargers want to be the manliest team in the NFL?
Yeah.
It may not be winning a Super Bowl, but being the most manly is a very close second best. Yeah. You think about Josh Downs by contrast, right? And you have a player here who almost certainly should have been drafted earlier. As a 20-year-old player there at North Carolina, he has a 40% yardage market share, 36% dominator, massive numbers in yards per team attempt. He goes for over 100 yards per game. You're talking about a guy who is small, but is also freakishly athletic. He has a good follow-up season in 2022. He comes out in 2023, has a solid rookie season, comes back in 2024, and was targeted on one of the highest percentages of routes in the entire NFL last year. He gets that 26% target share. And this is not within an offense that doesn't have other pieces, right? Adonai Mitchell comes in as an interesting deep threat. You have Alec Pierce playing well in the vertical role. You have Michael Pittman as an established wide receiver 1. Within all of that, Downs comes through. He's the guy who's playing through injury. He's making highlight catches. He's got a racer above 1, despite the fact that his quarterback is the least accurate quarterback in the NFL by a wide margin. Now, obviously, you have an element where he's being targeted underneath. Easier to have higher racers in that environment. But we're talking about Downs as probably being just, again, very similar. We've gotten some pushback at times from listeners when we say that Josh Downs is basically Zay Flowers in just a slightly worse, if maybe dramatically worse situation. I think as last year progressed, it became very clear that that was the case, if not that Josh Downs is better. Now, certainly I don't think that you should pay the same price for Downs that you would pay for a Zay Flowers. Even at a somewhat enthusiastic price, I do still have Flowers as someone that I want a part of my 2025 game plan. But when you're thinking about this vast difference in prices, the other thing is you just go to the Game Splits app. You can see the Downs is like 15 points per game with this like very straightforward low end wide receiver 1 profile when Richardson was not the main starter in the game. Richardson is a gigantic problem, certainly for Tyler Warren's ADP, which makes no sense within the context of where Michael Pittman is, where Downs is. And yet you think about this, and if the Colts can simply avoid, and maybe this is the most likely thing because they're just going to be in such a difficult situation, but if they can avoid the bouncing back and forth, if they can avoid this idea of, okay, let's give Richardson another chance, but then he plays a couple of bad games, we put Daniel Jones out there, we don't win with him, he looks like Daniel Jones, we go back to Anthony Richardson, he continues to throw zero inaccurate passes would be great. Zero accurate passes in a game. And then you're like, well, we got to try and win, back to Daniel Jones. I'm not saying that they shouldn't make some moves during the course of the season, but we do have multiple scenarios that would work here, right? Which is A, that in year 3, Anthony Richardson actually takes that Josh Allen jump, or that he fails and you go to Daniel Jones and Daniel Jones unlocks some of these guys, because this offense is going to be well coordinated. It's going to be well put together. They have a ton of weapons. It's going to be very different for Daniel Jones than it was with the Giants, where he didn't necessarily have all of those things. If he could just merely be okay, you're going to unlock a lot of these other Colts pieces. It's tough because you do worry about drafting a variety of guys who then just don't have value. But for the drafters of Taylor and Warren, Downs, Pittman, I do think that there are paths that will work out this year. And certainly some of those paths are that it works out in ways that are absolutely league winning.
So is there any of those that I assume Josh Downs is a priority target? I think you gave your thoughts on Quinten Johnson. There wasn't a lot in there on Mims. Is Mims somebody who is interesting but not a priority?
Yeah, I don't know what to make of Marvin Mims. It was so exciting that he finished strong last season. And you do have this element with him where, I mean, you could argue like how much is really different between Marvin Mims and Xavier Worthy. Now, one of them was drafted earlier in the draft, is faster, produced younger, was elite earlier in college. But when we think about the skills that the guys bring, when we think about how Mims was used last year, and even go back to the collegiate numbers where Mims wasn't a star in his first couple of years at Oklahoma, but Mims was one of these guys where one of the reasons he was so interesting is that he came in as a 21-year-old rookie, right? So we're talking about him being a 23-year-old third-year player coming off of a season where he had manufactured touches and he started to successfully hit on deep passes at the end of the year. I guess my concern with Mims is that the Broncos have done an interesting enough job building depth and still are in a position where it's extremely unclear, right? Pat Bryant is one of those guys where if he ends up being the relatively unique type of immediate rookie smash from where he was picked, and not just where he was picked, but what his profile is, right? Because it was a good profile specifically from a 2024 production perspective, not a great full career profile, obviously. But you have him, and he is interesting. There's just no other way around that. And he's the most recent guy that they added. But you have Cortland Sutton. He's probably going to be very solid. You have Evan Ingram. He's probably going to be very solid. You have RJ Harvey, probably being more involved in the passing game than the backs were last year. You have Marvin Mims, who's going to be able to do some of the things that now maybe go to Harvey, but also you have the vertical component. But then you also have Troy Franklin, which I think we have to keep coming back to him. He's someone else where when you look at the production profile and the age, if we're talking about someone who disappointed as a rookie and yet still does break out down the line, it would be someone with a Troy Franklin type of profile. So even though they don't necessarily have a bunch of stars in this offense, they have more interesting guys and they have less clarity than most teams. That makes it tough to draft someone who disappointed as a rookie, and then his success in his second season was kind of weird and mixed.
I'm still intrigued, Shawn, even after all of that. I think there was enough at the end of last season to entice me to draft him some again this off season as we head into the season. But that is where we're going to finish off today, as we talked about some of the third-year options in 2025. Hopefully that answered the question coming in from TKL. We appreciate that question as well. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on social media at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. You can check out all of his work, including the Big Gorilla 12,000 word article up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.